Rivers Alliance, and we co-host the Waccamaw Conference with MAVE and the North Inlet Winyah Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve. And this year we are thrilled to also have American Rivers join us as one of our hosts. American Rivers and Winyah Rivers Alliance started the Waccamaw River Blue Trail together. So it made sense that since we're focusing on the Blue Trail this year, we would include them as a host. We're thrilled to have them, and both Maeve and I are education providers with the Coastal Waccamaw Stormwater Education Consortium, so we are hosting on their behalf as well.
Thanks, Kara. Haley, do you want to give a quick intro as well? Oh, Haley, you're on mute. I'll give an intro for Haley. Haley is the education specialist with the North Inlet Winyah Bay Reserve, and she's going to help out today. Thank you, Haley. And last but not least, I want to introduce our speaker today. Cheryl Sievers-Cail is the Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Tribe, but Cheryl, would you like to come on and do an intro as well?
Sure. So as Maeve said, my name's Cheryl. Actually, it's Cail, but Sievers-Cail. I'm Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Indian People, and I'm also chair of South Carolina Idle No More, which is a committee under the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission. So that is how I ended up getting involved with water-related issues. It's going back to, oh my goodness, back when we did flash mobs, if anybody remembers that. And so it made sense to continue with collaborating with river keepers. And of course, pandemic has halted a lot of the collaboration, but now we're kind of getting to a norm with, here we are, virtual Zoom conference. So I'm glad that you are here, and I hope you enjoy the conference and take away something from it.
Thank you, Cheryl. We're so happy that you're here. And one silver lining of our virtual world is that we can bring together all these people that maybe we couldn't have all gotten together in one place. So thank you again.
Absolutely.
All right, so before we dive in, I just want to give a quick intro to really, the purpose of the Waccamaw Conference and just kind of orient us in place, because we're going to talk a lot about place today. So we're focused on the Waccamaw River watershed, which contains the Waccamaw River Blue Trail, which travels 140 miles from Lake Waccamaw to Winyah Bay. So it's a huge land area spanning 2 different states. And we want to know where you are in the Waccamaw River watershed. So Kara, could you go ahead and launch the poll for everyone participating? You should see a poll box pop up. And you can go ahead and let us know generally where you are in the watershed. All right, I see some answers coming in. All right, I think we got the majority of answers. Do you want to go ahead and show the results, Kara?
I can do that.
Awesome. So actually, we've got a really good mix of people, especially in the lower parts of the watershed from Conway down towards Winyah Bay, and some people from outside the watershed, which is great. Thank you for joining us. So this is great. We're going to talk about really the North Carolina, South Carolina state line area today in particular. But I think, the thing about watersheds is that everything's connected. So it's great that we can all be part of this together. So like I said, we're focusing on the North Carolina, South Carolina state line because the Waccamaw Conference is really organized around a journey down the Waccamaw River, starting at Lake Waccamaw and traveling all the way down to Winyah Bay. Next week, we'll focus on the Conway, Horry County area. And I'm sorry, the colors came out a little weird on this. That might be hard to see. And then looking at the Waccamaw Refuge and Waccamaw Neck, and finally, Winyah Bay. Oh, and we have another poll. We want to ask people how long you've been in the Waccamaw watershed or somewhere similar. So, Kara, can you put that up? Because I think this is an area that's growing and changing a lot. And I think, we've got people that have different experiences within the Waccamaw watershed. Cool, I see answers coming in. All right, I think that's all the answers. So some people have been here longer than 10 years. Most people are, within 1 to 5 years of having moved to the Waccamaw watershed. That's me as well. Although I have, a lifelong history of coming here, but have permanently moved here. And then some people are brand new, and of course, we all wish we lived here. All right. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Cheryl, but we're going to do something a little interesting today. Cheryl recently gave an interview for the American Rivers podcast, We Are Rivers, and we want to use that as our starting point for our discussion today. So we're going to listen to the podcast together along with some wonderful photos that Cheryl provided. And we'll pause about halfway through. It's a 28-minute podcast to discuss and reflect and take any questions that you all might have. And then we'll have a good 15 minutes or more at the end for discussion and questions. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and transition over to the podcast. And please bear with me 1 second as I pull this up. All right, Kara, do you see that screen share?
I've got it.
Great. Oh, actually, excuse me 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and start our podcast and pull up the seminar.
This is Faye Hartman, and you're listening to We Are Rivers, conversations about the rivers that connect us, a podcast series brought to you by American Rivers. We Are Rivers often focuses on the relationships that people have with rivers, the threats to those rivers, stories from the river, and the important policies and actions that impact rivers. But this episode is about the way a history of colonization and racial injustice in this country has built barriers between people and the rivers that course through their history, their culture, and being, and the spiritual and emotional connections that remain. For Cheryl Sievers-Cail and the Waccamaw Indian people, layers of erasure and oppression eroded that vital relationship between people and the river that they relied on. But for Cheryl, the impacts of displacement don't just live in the past. And it's essential to her that the connection Waccamaw Indian people still have with the river is strengthened, and that it's reestablished for the future of their communities and for the future of the Waccamaw River. Before we dive in, let's take a minute to get oriented. The ancestral lands of the Waccamaw Indian people surround the Waccamaw River in what today is the northeast region of South Carolina. A significant portion of American River's work in South Carolina focuses on promoting the Waccamaw River Blue Trail, a locally led effort to galvanize support to protect the Waccamaw River. In our work to make sure that efforts on the Waccamaw River Blue Trail reflect the diversity of local residents who care about the river and are impacted by the river, we believe it's important to connect with the people who carry its name. This is how we met Cheryl Sievers-Cail, second chief of the Waccamaw Indian people. The ancestral lands of the Waccamaw Indian people is a landscape where history lives in the present, where modern efforts to protect important tribal lands unearth the ancestral remains of tribes very much alive and dependent on those same lands. The modern day hub of the Waccamaw Indian people is a 45-minute drive from Myrtle Beach and a world apart. Cheryl lives as a bridge between those worlds.
Well, my name is Cheryl Cail. A lot of people refer to me as Cheryl Sievers-Cail because I just couldn't get rid of my former name, and so now it's a hyphenated name that I don't legally have, but I am the vice chief of the Waccamaw Indian people. I'm also the chair of Idle No More, which is a committee under the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission. And I live in Myrtle Beach, in an area called Socastee. And I just, for some reason, love the fact that I know Socastee is a native Indian name, and that I'm living in a place that my ancestors lived in and hunted in and thrived in for a time.
Cheryl is one of those people whose mind never stops. She's a notary by day, the second chief of the Waccamaw Indian people, and the chair of the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission's Idle No More Committee. She's an anthropologist and a historian in everything she does, and her drive to better understand her history and the history of the Waccamaw Indian people permeates her every interaction. When I catch up with her on a Thursday evening in September, she's just home after a long day. I win out over her dog, and I ask her about the relationship between the Waccamaw Indian people and the river.
So the connection for the Waccamaw being river people, so to speak, it's there. It's there as part of who we are. There's the debate about whether the Waccamaw River was named after the people or whether the people were named after the river. And when I think about it in the sense of how would they have known to call it that unless the people that were there on the river told them what the name of the river was. And that would mean the Waccamaw had that deep of a connection with the river that it became who they were, or it was who they were. Rivers are, in our culture, rivers are a life source. And it's not just for us as two-legged creatures, but for four-legged creatures, for the fish, for the birds. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense because when you think about water, you think about rivers or any body of water. That's how it's referred to, a body of water. And it's a vein that feeds through the body, which is the land, and so necessary. So our relationship today is still as a steward, as having respect for that and caring for it. There's one particular place that I'm drawn to, having lived in that area, is the Waccamaw Landing. It's part, right down in Myrtle Inlet, and because there have been remains that have been excavated from there, it was a known burial site, and those remains still are housed in Charleston Museum. Still, those remains have not been repatriated. They're still in the same place, and they have been for decades. we've been trying to get the remains released to repatriate them, rebury them. And under NAGPRA, we can't do anything as a state recognized tribe because NAGPRA applies to federally recognized tribes.
NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Like Cheryl said, it applies to federally recognized tribes. There is a process for repatriation to non-federally recognized tribes, but it is voluntary on the part of the museum that holds the collection, and non-federally recognized tribes do not have the same ability to compel a museum to repatriate. The Waccamaw Indian people were the first tribe to receive official recognition by the state of South Carolina. That happened in 2005. However, the Waccamaw Indian people are not a federally recognized tribe. In many ways, this disconnection between the Waccamaw people and the remains of their ancestors mirrors the way they were displaced and disconnected from the river.
I feel sometimes that we're just on the outside watching as everything else happens. And so for so long, that's where we've been kind of pushed to the outside. And I would like to see that reconnection for our people.
The Waccamaw Indian people were literally pushed from the river's edge. And, as is the case for Indigenous people around the world, the impacts of colonization disconnected people from the landscapes where they root their culture, their history, and their stories. Often, gaping questions and gaps are what remain.
It's a lot of trying to research something where you don't have a lot of documentation, because things like that they just weren't written down. Oral tradition is how things were shared, and there's a huge break in that. Once you had the effort of genocide, essentially, you can't really maintain a culture when language is removed and there's fear for retribution if you identify yourself as a group of people that are being killed off. And unfortunately, in the South, particularly in the Southeast, we have just very little because of the early encounters with colonists. The historical part of where we were located, this has been a challenge for me as far as the research, and I think it's been a challenge for a lot of the researchers. Documentation is very limited. You have to look at everything all together, piecing together things like your maps. And when you look at some of the historical documents as far as what I've uncovered in that, we were located about 80 miles north of Charleston at one point. And so present day, that would be Polly's Island, Merle's Inlet, the Grand Strand. But then there were 6 villages at one point in 1715. I think it was the account that was given of about 600 to 800 Waccamaw living in 6 villages. And so there's nothing documenting where those villages were. So then you have to rely on archaeological evidence, and that's starting to come together.
Trying to understand where the Waccamaw Indian people lived is one challenge, and trying to understand how they made decisions and related to one another within the tribe is even more difficult. And in no small part, that's because of historic encounters that were influenced by and filtered through the lens of white settlers.
This is up for discussion with people. I've read a lot that there was a matriarchal society. I don't necessarily believe that existed when the colonists came, because you have to understand that women weren't considered by colonists to be somebody that they would engage with. So whether or not it was a matriarchal society, the decisions being made, I think the chiefs that were going to meet to speak with governors to try to trade and make trade decisions, it was predominantly men, and that is really it. We don't have a lot of documentation of how the structure was. We do know that there were female chiefs within different tribes in this area.
Similarly, this intentional erasure poses real challenges for people like Cheryl who want to understand how belief systems and spirituality of the tribe has changed over time.
If I were to talk about the beliefs as far as historically ancestral beliefs, spirituality, it may look quite a bit different probably than today. I do know that there was an understanding of a great spirit, a creator, and that was shown through respect for the provisions, through everything that you had available to you, and that the belief of animals having spirits themselves. I have my own spiritual connection, and it's an eagle, and it's kind of a strong spiritual connection to that particular animal, but it's more because of the representation of the eagle soaring, and that is my actual tribal name, Soaring Eagle, bringing prayers to the Creator, to the Great Spirit, rather. And that is just something that I've always known I could do that. And I think because of being very young and believing very much that my prayers were heard, that it just fell on me. Within the tribe, not everybody has that same name, and there's different levels of belief, but that doesn't discount their spirituality. They just believed along a different line. Traditionally, there was definitely a connection with the spirit, the Great Spirit, the grandfathers, those that gave us wisdom and understanding, and then also the Creator that provided. I believe again that our ancestors looked at the rivers as a part of a body, and that was so important. Spiritually, I can't go on a river today or be even out there fishing on a river without feeling that connection.
The deep respect and
All right, I think that's a really good place to pause. And we can come back on video. Oh, bear with me while I deal with screen sharing. There we go. So that's about halfway through the podcast. And it would help if I turned my video on. I just wanted to take a second and reflect on everything we've heard so far, and let you, Cheryl, talk about, we ended on that note of spiritual connection and learning about the traditions of the Waccamaw. I'd love to hear more about what you think about that and your experience reconnecting to culture and spirituality. We also had a question in the chat, and for anyone else, please feel free to drop a question in the Q&A at any time, and we can get to those in a second. But Cheryl, I'll turn it over to you now.
So the one thing in the podcast, I actually have an easier time doing this live Zoom, speaking about the spirituality. if you think about it, the connection is, it's an ancestral river. So for the people, for my ancestors, this was their river. Not that they owned it, but everything that they looked for provision, it was provided from the Waccamaw River. It was what they were known as, the people of the Waccamaw. And when it comes to this whole idea of resources, what occurred when colonization began, actually before it began, there was just an endeavor to extract resources, to find resources. I mean, it was an actual chase between European countries of who could find the gold, the wealth, the furs, the skins, and of course there was also the trade commodity of people. And unfortunately, that exploitation, it actually at one point almost caused the beaver to become extinct early on, because of all of the trappings of beavers for the beaver furs. When you think about when you're a steward of something, it doesn't mean to be gluttonous of it, and it certainly doesn't mean to be abusive. And that's what, when you're balanced spiritually, you don't do those things. You're not gluttonous, you're not hoarding, and you're certainly not abusive. And there's a respect that I just, I can't say I wasn't living with my ancestors, but I do know of the ways of indigenous people. And as I call my kin out in the Dakotas, who are standing to protect their land and their water resources, it goes without saying, water is life. And when you think about life that is here and now, what connects us spiritually is that water, that it connects us to people, it connects us to nature, it connects us to everything. And we do have a great responsibility to protect it, to be stewards of it. So thinking about that, it's not for me so much. I may not be able to do it a whole lot to change the things that have been done in the past for me today, but it's for the future. It's for the children that have not been born, or as we say, the 7 generations yet unborn. I don't want to think that great grandchildren or great great grandchildren or whoever may be living a couple hundred years from now will look back and wonder why we were so neglectful, why we were so self-centered. What was, what kind of a legacy is that leaving? So fighting to protect and be responsible, it's not really much of a fight. I mean, not saying that flippant. It's just, that's just the way it is. And I wanted to say this because Winona LaDuke is one of my, I'm going to say she's an awesome woman. She said that if we do nothing, things will not go well for our children. And that is so true. So we're not put here to hoard the resources, but we're to be stewards of them. And it is a great responsibility. Whether that comes from just your own character and nature, or whether it comes from a spiritual sense of moral right and wrong, I believe that when the two are connected together, or when you are balanced spiritually, that you're going to have that good character. So we see that when people don't have good character, when they don't care, when they're self-centered, when it's about them, they don't protect, and they're not good stewards, and they're abusive, and they're neglectful, and they're disrespectful. And we can't be that way. So I see there's some questions. So,
Yeah, we do have a few. Cheryl, is there one that you're especially excited? And then we should probably get back to the podcast, but we can definitely circle back to the rest of these at the end.
how is the Waccamaw Tribe in South Carolina connected to the Waccamaw Sioux, which is a North Carolina recognized tribe who historically lived near the Upper Waccamaw? So I researched, and I've actually found the connection, believe that they were just another village. When people think of Waccamaw in South Carolina, Waccamaw in North Carolina, there weren't state lines. there was no, matter of fact, in North and South Carolina battled between where the state line was going to be for a couple of years before it finally was firm. I think it was 1719. So pretty early on. Prior to that, I just simply believe that we were just separated by, attributed to the villages where we lived, not that we were a separate tribe. That whole concept of, that's they are them and we are us, that kind of thing, it doesn't even make sense to me. So when I think of the Waccamaw Sioux, I absolutely know that there were Waccamaw living in North Carolina, just as there were, as it's documented, Waccamaw living 80 miles north of Charleston. I believe 6 villages of Waccamaw that was accounted for, which there may have been even more. They certainly couldn't have surveyed the entire landscape and known where every single village was. I'm sure they tried really hard because they wanted to know where they were going to acquire good land that was already being farmed and productive. So, but that's I would answer that question. And yes, it would be wonderful to have the Waccamaw Blue Trail connect better to Indigenous history and culture. I love to see what was done. Janae Davis did a great job. So I don't know if there's
well, that might be a good place to stop for now, and then we can come back to some more questions at the end. So for participants, please feel free to keep adding questions. We do see them, and then they show up for everyone once they've been answered. But thank you, Cheryl. And yeah, that was a really nice question, because I think, the river connects North and South Carolina, and it sounds like people have always been connected across, that quote unquote border for a long time.
Yes, they have. I have a cousin who's done a lot of research with me, and we have seen through doing genealogical research and historical research this back and forth movement from the border of North Carolina to just over the North Carolina border back down to here. And I think just, at certain times, the things that were happening caused people to move, just like it does today. People move. So that, that's definitely a truth there.
Awesome. All right, well, let's switch back to the podcast. That'll go for another 12 minutes or so, and then we can come back and have some more conversation. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Connection that the Waccamaw Indian people had to their land was, from the very first encounter with colonizers, threatened.
Well, your earliest encounter, and that was they tricked about 150 Indians onto their boat with offers of, shiny things that they had never seen before.
And then they took them and sailed away down to the Caribbean to trade them for as slaves. And so that was in earliest colonialism, I say, or encounter. So it wasn't really colonialism. They attempted to establish a settlement, and it failed. And that was later on return. And then after that, the English successfully came over and, of course, claimed all the land from sea to shining sea, and quite a big swath of land. So at that point, it was just a matter of the tribes that were living in the location they were living would be pushed out because of the claim for land. So these villages ended up being overtaken by those that wanted the land to establish plantations.
The Waccamaw Indian people, other indigenous groups, and Africans were enslaved on plantations along the Waccamaw River and other rivers throughout the region. Rice was one of the many primary crops cultivated. Many of these rice fields remain intact and are still present on the river today.
I most certainly know that there were Waccamaw that were enslaved. And the reason is because in that last encounter, it says that there were Waccamaw that were captured and taken into slavery. And there were also Waccamaw that were killed. So how common was that? I absolutely believe that the early colony, before they really had the institution of African-American slavery, they were trading Indians. They were trading the Native Americans, the indigenous people. You can look at some of the historical newspapers and you can see where there's a runaway Indian slave that they're offering a reward for. And if you think about this whole thing, you're not counted as Indian once you're a slave. You're just this piece of property, and so it was just either you were a free person of color, or you were a slave, or you were white. That designation that slavery impacted our people, my great-great-great-great-grandfather and the John Demery that came and formed the Demery settlement was listed as a free person of color with 5 other free persons of color. And my question when I first started really getting to research was, if he was a free person of color, does that mean that at one point in time he wasn't free? And I believe that that's the case. So as you see, there's this movement of where should the Waccamaw Indian people live? And that is, it's pretty hard to be displaced to a point where you may end up being the military front against hostile Indians, or you may be encroaching on land that was currently being used by another tribe that wasn't friendly. It's interesting when you think about it from the perspective of a group of people just trying to survive and trying to find their place, and they just kept having a real difficult time because they were getting it from both sides.
Through attempted genocide, enslavement, the loss of lands and connection, the Waccamaw Indian people lost some of their critical connections with the river.
We don't have the same connection. I can say that. As far as physically,
a lot of that has to do with being removed from the area. You're not on the Waccamaw River.
But despite being removed from their lands, Cheryl and others remain deeply concerned about the river and the threats that it faces.
There are some people that are tribal members that live on the river who have a lot of concerns because of development, because the changes that are happening that are kind of taking away from the beauty of the river, threatening the wildlife, threatening the flora and the fauna. Personally, for me, the relationship that I have with the rivers, I know that I don't want it to be polluted, and that's partly because it should be respected. It should be cared for. We should be stewards of it, and that doesn't seem to be happening because there's the attitude that you can pollute a little bit. And I always equate it to the tray of brownies. If I offer you brownies and say, these are brownies and they're really good and you'll enjoy them. But if I tell you that these are brownies and I've just got a little bit of poop in them, you really don't want those brownies anymore. They're not safe. And I'm not talking about poop in the river. That is obviously an issue. I'm talking about the intentional, it's okay to contaminate and pollute the river just a little bit. And I don't think that that's ever been the way it was supposed to be, because that's not respect. It's abuse. And that is my relationship with the river, because we are going to, at some point in time, leave this for the generations that haven't come yet, and we're going to leave them with something that won't be what it was. It won't be what it was intended to be. And it won't be safe for anything. I've been following this whole issue with the contamination of the river. And I went to Poop Matters, and it really does, because it's really bad to have that in your water. It can be removed, but I'm looking at a list of quantifiable PFAS that have been identified in the Waccamaw River at different test sites. And that just bothers me. It bothers me so much because it's bioaccumulative. It's not something that should be there to begin with. Just shouldn't be there to begin with. It's still poop in the brownies. It's still bad. And I think for me as a steward, I need to say, that's not okay, so stop it. Because it's got to have a chance to heal. And you're not doing that if you're saying we can keep discharging just a little bit. And we're not being responsible by saying it's okay. It's okay if I throw a little bit of trash out my window when I'm driving my car, isn't it? It's not.
The Waccamaw meanders through one of the fastest growing areas on the East Coast. The populations of Horry and Georgetown counties combined grew by 62% between the year 2000 and the year 2018. This has led to land conversion that increases runoff, flooding, and pollutants into the Waccamaw River.
You can sit here and say the law says this is what's supposed to happen. But again, when you don't have a very big voice and you're not able to implement change.
Cheryl works hard to have her voice heard and to educate communities about the impacts of PFAS. In her position as the chairperson of the Idle No More Committee for the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission, she fights for the protection of the environment, land reclamation, and the repatriation of Native American artifacts and remains, and the preservation of sacred sites. And even though she constantly faces challenges to be heard and barriers to reestablish the connection between the Waccamaw Indian people and the river, for Cheryl, it's what has to happen.
Why is it important? Because it's part of it. It's like going back to where you came from and that source of life for the people. You connect with that. There's a little bit of our ancestors left there. There's a little bit of who we are, and I think everybody needs to know for themselves who they are, and where they came from, and what was important. What you miss so much if you just live in the here and now, and that's it. And here and now, there's nothing wrong with living in the present, but take a look at what it was that was important, why it was important. So that part is reconnecting to the river. I can't really say what I have a vision for it, but I do know that it's an important part of where we came from, of who we are. That we are a part of the river, but the river is also a part of us.
Thank you for listening to We Are Rivers, conversations about the rivers that connect us. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment.
All right, so we can come back and discuss. And just as a reminder, that was the We Are Rivers podcast from American Rivers. And Cheryl, that was a great interview. Thanks so much for letting us share that. And also thank you to American Rivers for letting us share it. And thank you as well for the great photos that you provided. I guess we can just start there. Is there anything you want to tell us about those pictures that we all got to see?
Well, this was pre-pandemic, 2019. That was our powwow, the last one that we had. Hopefully we'll be having one this year if things go well. It's really important for us because it's our chance to celebrate culture, to help preserve it, pass it on. And, when I say we've lost a lot of our culture, there was a real disconnect. And, I was listening to this NPR program. I love listening to NPR. There's how you can take a person's, you can take the land and the language, and you've pretty much conquered that group. So the connection, especially with land, and not that, there wasn't this idea of you own it. It was a resource, and it was a place that, provision was made. So ownership was just not something that was understood until colonialism. I think territories, certainly there were agreements between tribes that, you're going to hunt here, we're going to hunt there. And they were essentially honored. And when they weren't, then they had their wars between tribes. So it was just a completely different aspect. But when we celebrate our powwow, we're able to not just share in our culture, but also in our spiritual beliefs. There's just so much tradition that's passed on through that. When I first moved to Myrtle Beach in 2005, my son was 7 years old, and he had already attended a few powwows up in Connecticut where we lived at the Mohegan tribe. And so he was absolutely enthralled with the fact that he could get out there and these were his people. And so that connection, not just with the land, but with people, with society, the society that is, this is part of who you are. That's important. And I think it's important for every child to have that. I've seen him thrive because he had that. So for kids, and kind of going a little bit off topic, but for kids to be able to actually learn about themselves when they're in school through history and things that are significant to them, they're seeing something important. They're seeing a little bit of themselves, and that connection, it's such a circle. We connect with the land, we connect with other people, we connect with little animals that are crying. Sorry about that. I've got to pet her or else she'll keep crying. So it's a blessing to be able to do that. And I think the best part is sharing that with other people. I laugh when some people, they come in and they're very reserved. They're afraid to even sometimes participate and come in like it's not something that they're allowed to do. And the one thing that I've always expressed when people are, first time visitors, first time coming to a powwow, is no, that's not our way. That's not the way the Indigenous people are, especially when it comes to the celebration part and sharing of our culture. And I think it's always been that way. So I often wonder what would have happened had the encounter with colonists had been different, if there had been mutual respect, instead of this, whether it was fear or just an agenda. I'm not really, I wasn't there, so I don't know, but I think that part of it was fear, and I think that the other part was agenda, and then also the idea that the people that were coming over were more spiritual than the people that they were encountering, which was just not the case. If they had just taken the time to get to know the people, the Indigenous people that they met coming, how would it look today?
Good question.
So,
earlier you mentioned, language as a really important part of what maintains a culture. We actually had two kind of language related questions in the Q&A box. I wanted to see if you might want to talk about those.
Yeah, I see the first one that is kind of a question. If I'm aware of WikiTongue's project and the effort to preserve languages around it. I'm not aware of it, but there is an attendee on the conference, Kevin Dida, who has shared with me a Lakota, which would be the original language of the Siouan language that was spoken by the tribes here. I think it eventually became kind of corrupted, and then also the exposure, just like anything else, if you have people in a certain area, they're going to speak slightly different. The challenge with the languages of the Sioux speakers, Siouan speaking natives, is that there are numerous different dialects. So it's not just one. So when people, and I know the chief has said, well, we probably spoke closer to Catawba. And I kind of think, well, maybe not so much, because our encounters with them weren't as great. And the Catawbas may have adopted some other tweaks of their language, so to speak, because of who they were engaging with. But again, this is history that is not documented, very little of language, and then of course not being able to share it. You had boarding schools which was forced assimilation, literally ripping children from families and placing them in schools and forcing them to adopt colonial ways of speaking and dressing and acting. So having that, being able to rekindle the language would be great. I'm learning some. It's a really hard language to learn. It's extremely hard, because it's not like anything that we would, have, oh, well, this is a good alternative, or this looks similar to that. It's reprogramming your brain. So that would be a great project for any tribe, because that's important. So I do appreciate that Kevin shared that, and I'm continuing to work on it. The older I get, the harder it is to learn something like a language. We'll say that, and definitely you have to use it, or you just, yeah. So I see there's another question. Some of my students at school wonder if there's evidence of, or if how the tribe used sharks. They found some papers online about Seminole using the teeth on weapons. Now, I do know that there were weapons that were made from, obviously, claws of bears, but I don't know about sharks so much. Probably more because of where you're at. Again, it's what's the resource that's available. And I'm certain that if they had access to shark's teeth, they were using them as tools or whatever they needed to use them for. So I don't know if there's any other questions. Is there yes, there is. Is there a representation by Indigenous communities on the Myrtle Beach Regional Economic Development Group? I'm not sure. Chief Hatcher might be involved in that. And yes, Winyan is Lakota, and his woman, and Lakota is woman. So I wanted to bring that up. That was something I did, and when I did a presentation at Coastal, I said, I was looking at the word Winyan is woman, and thinking, so what is the possibility that these men that arrived at Winyah Bay, and they were all men, certainly, coming off of their ships, encountered a group of Indigenous women that were working on the shore. And as they were trying to communicate, asking, what are you? Which is probably what they would have asked. What are you? Who are you? Trying to communicate. And women were standing there thinking they probably have never seen anything like us. And they kept saying, Winyan, we're women. And that's how the Winyah people got their name, and Winyah Bay. So it's funny because anthropologists that was at the presentation said they never put that together. It's like, well, it seemed obvious to me. So it just, yeah, it's amazing because language is that thing that connects us as well. And it obviously can be something that separates us or causes a break between groups of people.
That's a really interesting discovery and theory of how Winyah Bay was named. And that actually gets to another question that was just about Indigenous place names and understanding, like Sockasty is, so many different places have their roots in Indigenous languages. So So we do have a few more questions, and I think we could chat all night because there's so many things to discuss. I do just want to quickly give a few wrap up announcements just in case people need to move on with their evening. And Cheryl, I want to respect your time as well. But if you'd like to come back and maybe chat for a few minutes more, we can do that. But if you can hang on 1 second, I just want to
Sure.
one more time. So first of all, thank you so much to Cheryl and to all of our participants today. We were so happy to be able to have this discussion in this webinar. The Waccamaw Conference is an entire month of events, some virtual, some in person. We really have tried to, cover a bunch of different topics in a bunch of ways so that everyone can be involved all across the watershed. The best way to learn more about upcoming Waccamaw Conference activities is to go to the website. I'll actually drop a link to the website in the chat in just a moment. And I want to just give a quick announcement for the next seminar in the webinar series, which will be a historical overview of the Waccamaw River, especially focused around Conway. And that'll be from Walter Hill, the director of the Horry County Museum. That'll be next week, April 6th at 1 p.m. And you can register for that webinar by going to the Waccamaw Conference website. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone again. And we'll stick around for maybe 5 more minutes. We can touch on a few more questions and then we can wrap up. And I'll put a link to the chat, or I'll put a link in the chat right now. All right, so for those sticking around, Cheryl, I just wanted to give you an open opportunity. Is there anything else you wanted everyone to know about the Waccamaw Indian people? Any other thoughts you want to share?
Got the little
I know.
critter in my lap. She's just, I'll apologize. She's an attention hound. So if you're not paying attention to her when you're in the room with her, she's gonna cry or sit on your lap. So yeah, for the our efforts right now have been obviously federal recognition. As a state recognized tribe, some of the barriers that we face are being consulted with on projects that are happening around that could impact the possibly remains, artifacts, literally historical sites that, we would identify with. So we're kind of being kept in the loop. I just received something today to let me know that there's a project to put in a gas line that's about 16 miles, I think it is. And it's going to go through an area that has 2 archaeological, known archaeological sites. But I received it and it was the public comment period ended last year in July. So it's kind of a, well, we're going to let you know, but we're going to let you know after, because we're not really required to tell you during that period of time where you should be notified. That's one of the reasons, part of it, why we are striving for federal recognition. It's a construct that was not established by us. This is a total government construct, the same as the blood quantum for Indians, which is very infuriating. When somebody asks you, well, how much Indian are you? I just shake my head and go, really, how much white are you? So it's kind of a, like, how do you quantify who you are on a percentage? And eventually, with that kind of theory of, well, eventually there, unless you're going to marry within your own race, which, my great grandparents did, but they married within their own family, you're going to eventually extinct yourself from that race unless you continue to marry indigenous peoples. And so fortunately, and this is the part that's kind of the irony of it, because of the systemic racism that existed for so long, and the laws that said miscegenation, you're not allowed to marry outside your race, it actually created this almost system of keeping a bloodline more pure, if you would call it pure, or more indigenous. And that, I call it the irony of their own system. That fear of having mixed race marriages, and having indigenous peoples marrying in with whites, that it would end up causing problems, but their system of setting up that you eventually would no longer have indigenous blood, that so it was their, I'm going to say, their catch-22 system that was set up. It's interesting when you're going and looking at the way things worked out. As much as it was horrible and horrific to have natives forced to live on reservations, it actually helped to keep the culture alive. As much as there was an effort at one point to not do that. But I look at the people living like on reservations, struggling, very much struggling. And if you've ever been or seen what it's like on a reservation, it's abject poverty. So we just don't even have any idea of what it's like when, as I heard on a podcast, a woman actually froze to death in the winter in her own home because she didn't have heat. And we just can't even fathom that. And that's happening, where you heard during the pandemic, not having access to clean water. People, I wish that more people would be aware of that happening and not have this hands-off, well, it's not impacting us attitude, because they're American citizens just like everybody else. People that are living on reservations were promised certain things and supposed to be provided for because of giving up the land that they lived on, and then being forced to say, you're only going to live on this part of this land that's yours. We're going to take this. And I mean, this is not impacting us here in this area. We lost that a long time ago. The land that we lived on, even the little tiny bit of land that we had, the Demery settlement, it's only been 100 years since pretty much all of that land, other than the small 20 acres of land we have where our tribal offices and our tribal grounds are. It's been just 100 years ago that land was lost. So, and it certainly wasn't that everybody was living in the lap of luxury. So the concept of, I've had people ask me, well, don't you get free education? And don't you have a casino? And they just attribute this, and it's a false narrative that's been put out there, that all tribes are just thriving and making so much money, hand over fist casinos. They have free education, free healthcare. Kevin, who I don't know if he's still on here, has worked at the reservation, Cheyenne River Reservation, and he could probably speak quite a bit about how well that healthcare system works. So there's a lot of different things that, sharing information with people, making people more aware. When you're disconnected from what you, as a people, with what you've known and what your life was, for your culture, the only thing that we have now is to be able to try to preserve it through a powwow, and to share the culture through the powwow. It would be pretty hard to live it out each day.
Yeah, I heard you mention before keeping culture alive, and it's clear that that's, a passion for you, and we really appreciate everything you've done to, raise that awareness through this, and also to raise awareness of the very real inequities and systemic discrimination that has existed and still exists. And it's important to discuss it. It's challenging because obviously we can't solve these problems just in the span of one webinar, but
No.
I do want to thank you so much for everything you've shared. I think to respect people's time, it might be a good time to wrap up, but I want to thank you again. Thank you to all our participants. And like I said before, you can contact us through the Waccamaw Conference website. The link is in the chat. And thank you so much again to Cheryl, and we hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you.